The dust settled around Grace Vernon's boots as she knelt beside her father's grave, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white beneath the Kansas sun. It was barely dawn in Caldwell, and she had come to the cemetery at the edge of town before anyone else could witness her tears, before the shopkeepers opened their doors and the ranch hands rode in for supplies, before the world demanded she wear the mask of strength she had been perfecting for the past 3 weeks since the fever took him. "I don't know what to do, Papa," she whispered, her voice catching on the words. "The bank says I have 2 months to pay off your debts or they'll take the house. Mrs. Henderson offered me work at the boarding house, but it's not enough. Nothing is enough." The wind swept across the prairie grass, carrying with it the scent of approaching autumn and the promise of harder times ahead. Grace was 22 years old and utterly alone in the world. Her mother had died bringing her into it, and her father had raised her with equal parts love and determination, teaching her to read and cipher, to tend a garden and keep accounts, to pray when times got hard, and to work even harder when prayers seemed to go unanswered. She bent her head lower, tears finally spilling down her cheeks and darkening the dry earth below. "Lord, I know you have a plan," she prayed aloud, her voice stronger now despite the trembling in her chest. "I know Papa is with you now, free from pain. But I am scared, and I am tired, and I don't know which way to turn. Please show me the path. Please give me strength to walk it." The sound of boots on hard ground made her stiffen, embarrassment flooding through her at being discovered in such a vulnerable moment. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, hoping whoever it was would have the decency to pass by without comment. Instead, she felt a presence beside her, solid and warm despite the morning chill. Then a voice, low and respectful, asked a question that would change the course of her life. "May I pray with you?" Grace's eyes flew open, and she turned her head to find a man kneeling in the dust beside her. He was tall, she could tell even with him on his knees, with broad shoulders beneath a worn brown vest and a face that spoke of both hardship and kindness. His hat was in his hands, revealing dark hair that needed a trim, and his eyes were the color of whiskey in lamplight, warm and sincere as they met hers. She should have said no. A proper lady did not encourage strange men, even in a graveyard, even in prayer. But something in his expression stopped the refusal on her tongue. He looked at her not with pity or improper interest, but with genuine compassion, as though he understood the weight of grief because he had carried it himself. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Please." He bowed his head, and when he spoke, his voice carried the accent of someone who had been raised with education but had spent years in the company of cowboys and working men. "Heavenly Father, we come before you this morning with heavy hearts and uncertain paths ahead. We thank you for your presence in our darkest hours, for the promise that you will never leave us nor forsake us. We ask for your guidance, for your provision, and for the strength to face whatever trials may come. Comfort those who mourn, Lord, and let them feel your love surrounding them like arms that will never let go. In Jesus' name, amen." "Amen," Grace whispered, and when she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite name. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, gesturing to the fresh grave. "I saw you here yesterday morning too and the morning before. I didn't mean to intrude, but you looked like you might need someone to share the burden, even if just for a moment. You've been watching me." The words came out sharper than she intended, defensive. He had the grace to look chagrined. "Not watching. Noticing. There's a difference. I work at the Fletcher Ranch just west of town. I ride through here most mornings on my way in for supplies." He stood and offered her his hand. "Name's Daniel Irwin. Most folks call me Dan." She hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his and allowing him to help her to her feet. His palm was calloused from hard work, but his grip was gentle, steady. "Grace Vernon, Miss Vernon." He released her hand and took a step back, maintaining a respectful distance. "Your father was Thomas Vernon. I heard he was a good man. Helped my boss out of a tight spot a few years back. Never asked for anything in return." "That was Papa." Grace brushed the dust from her skirt, trying to compose herself. The vulnerability of being discovered in prayer, of accepting comfort from a stranger, made her feel exposed in a way that was both uncomfortable and oddly relieving. He believed in helping people. The world could use more men like him. Daniel turned his hat in his hands, and Grace noticed the worn leather of the band, the careful repairs that spoke of someone who took care of what he had. "I should let you get on with your mourning. I just wanted you to know that you're not praying alone." "God hears, Miss Vernon. Sometimes his answers just take longer than we'd like." He was turning to leave when Grace heard herself call out, "Mr. Irwin." He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Thank you for the prayer. It helped." The smile he gave her was small but genuine, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Any time, Miss Vernon. The offer stands if you ever need it again." She watched him walk to where his horse was tied near the cemetery gate. Mount up with the easy grace of a man who had spent half his life in the saddle, and ride off toward town. Only when he was out of sight did Grace realize she was smiling, just a little, for the first time since her father had closed his eyes for the last time. The morning sun was fully up now, painting the prairie gold and rose, and Grace made her way back to the small house at the edge of Caldwell that had been her home for all 22 years of her life. It was a simple structure, wood frame with a stone chimney, but her father had built it with his own hands when he first came to Kansas, full of dreams and determination. The garden out front was starting to fade with the changing season, but Grace had managed to harvest enough vegetables to see her through the winter if she was careful. Inside, the house still smelled faintly of the herbs her father had burned when the fever took him, trying to ease his breathing in those final days. Grace opened the windows despite the chill, needing fresh air and life to chase away the lingering scent of sickness and death. She had work to do. Mrs. Henderson expected her at the boarding house by 8 to help with the breakfast dishes and the changing of linens. It was hard work for little pay, but it was honest and it was something. Grace changed into her work dress, pinned up her honey-colored hair, and splashed water on her face from the basin, trying to erase the evidence of her tears. But as she walked the quarter-mile into town, she found her thoughts drifting back to Daniel Irwin and the unexpected kindness of his prayer. She knew most of the men who worked the ranches around Caldwell by sight if not by name, but she did not recall seeing him before. Perhaps he was new to the area, or perhaps she simply had not been paying attention, too caught up in caring for her dying father to notice much of anything beyond the walls of her home. The boarding house was a 2-story building on Main Street, freshly painted white with blue shutters, and a wide front porch where guests could sit and watch the town go by. Mrs. Henderson was a widow herself, a practical woman in her 50s who had turned her grief into industry, building a successful business that catered to traveling salesmen, cattle buyers, and the occasional family passing through on their way to California or Oregon. "Good morning, Grace," Mrs. Henderson called from the kitchen when she heard the back door open. "I've got the water heating all ready. There's a full house this morning, so we'll need to work quick." "Yes, madam." Grace tied an apron around her waist and set to work scraping and washing the dishes left from breakfast. The labor was mindless, allowing her thoughts to wander even as her hands stayed busy. She thought about her father's debts, carefully catalogued in the ledger she kept in the drawer beside her bed. $200 owed to the bank for a loan he had taken out 2 years ago when drought threatened the small farm he worked. He had planned to pay it back this harvest, but then the fever came, and with it the doctor's bills, the medicine that did not help, the final expenses of burial. $200 might as well have been $2,000. Even working every day at the boarding house, taking in mending and laundry on the side, Grace could not see a path to earning enough before the bank foreclosed. She had considered selling the house and land outright, but the property was mortgaged to the bank anyway, and what little equity her father had built would disappear in settling the debt, leaving her with nothing. "You're awfully quiet this morning, Mrs. Henderson observed, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she kneaded dough for the evening's bread. "More than usual, I mean. Just thinking, madam, about that bank situation, I'd wager." The older woman sighed. "Thomas was a good man, Grace, but he never did have a head for figures. He had a head for helping people, which is a gift, but it doesn't pay the bills." "No, madam." Grace scrubbed harder at a stubborn bit of egg stuck to a plate. "Have you thought about what I suggested? About finding a husband?" Grace's hands stilled in the soapy water. They had had this conversation before. "I'm not going to marry someone just to solve a financial problem, Mrs. Henderson. That wouldn't be fair to either of us." "Fair or not, it's what women have been doing since Eve took that apple. You're a pretty girl, Grace, and you've got sense. There are plenty of men around here who would be glad to have you, and a husband's income would solve your problems quick enough." "I'd rather solve them myself." Mrs. Henderson chuckled, but there was approval in it. "You've got pride, I'll give you that. Your father's daughter through and through. But pride won't keep a roof over your head come winter." The words stung because they were true, but Grace kept her mouth shut and focused on finishing the dishes. She had been raised to believe that marriage was about love and partnership, not financial transaction. Her parents had loved each other deeply despite her mother's early death, and her father had never remarried, saying no one could replace the woman he had lost. Grace wanted that kind of love for herself someday, wanted to choose a man because her heart called out to his, not because her bank account was empty. But maybe that was a luxury she could no longer afford. The day passed in a blur of work, changing sheets and scrubbing floors, helping Mrs. Henderson prepare the evening meal for the guests, washing more dishes after. By the time Grace walked home in the fading light, her back ached and her hands were raw from lye soap. The house was dark and empty, and for a moment Grace stood in the doorway, struck by how quiet it was without her father's presence. No fire in the stove, no lamp lit in welcome. Just shadows and silence and the weight of being utterly alone. She lit a lamp with trembling fingers and set about making herself a simple supper of bread and butter and the last of the summer vegetables from the garden. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, then cleaned up and pulled out her father's ledger to review the figures again as if they might have changed since yesterday. They had not. $200. 8 weeks. Impossible. Grace bent her head over the ledger and let the tears come again, hot and bitter. She had tried to be strong, tried to have faith, tried to believe that God would provide a way. But sitting alone in the gathering darkness, she felt small and scared and desperately uncertain. "Please," she whispered into the empty room. "Please show me what to do." The next morning, Grace returned to the cemetery before dawn, the habit of grief pulling her to her father's grave as surely as the tide pulled the moon. She knelt in the dust and began to pray, the words coming easier now, spilling out of her heart without filter or pretense. She did not hear Daniel approach, but when she opened her eyes, he was there again, kneeling beside her in the growing light. "May I pray with you?" he asked, just as he had the day before. This time Grace did not hesitate. Yes. They prayed together, Daniel's steady voice joining with hers, and when they finished, Grace found herself feeling fractionally less alone than she had the night before. "You come here every morning?" she asked as they both stood brushing dust from their clothes. "Most mornings," he admitted. "I lost my own father a few years back. Cancer took him slow. I find it helps to start the day remembering what's important, what's eternal, puts the rest in perspective. I'm sorry for your loss. And I'm sorry for yours." He settled his hat back on his head, the brim shading his eyes from the rising sun. "But I'm grateful our paths crossed because of it. There's comfort in shared understanding." Grace found herself studying him more closely in the better light of morning. He was perhaps 26 or 27, she guessed, with the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors but none of the hardness that sometimes came with ranch life. His clothes were clean if worn, his boots scuffed, but well maintained. Everything about him spoke of a man who worked hard, lived simply, and took care with what he had. "Mr. Irwin," she began, then paused, unsure what she wanted to say. "Dan," he corrected gently. "If we're going to keep meeting at dawn to pray, I think we can dispense with formalities." Dan. The name felt strange on her tongue, too familiar for a man she barely knew, but right somehow. "Do you believe God answers prayers?" Truly, his expression grew serious. "I do. But I also believe that sometimes his answer is not what we hope for, and sometimes the answer is yes, but the timing is his own." "Why do you ask?" She should not tell him. He was a stranger, a ranch hand she had met twice in a graveyard. But something in his kind eyes, in the genuine concern in his voice, loosened her tongue. "My father left debts. The bank will take our house if I can't pay them, and I can't see any way to earn enough in time. I've been praying for help, for a miracle, but nothing changes. The numbers in the ledger stay the same, and the deadline gets closer every day." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as if weighing something important. Finally, he asked, "How much?" "I shouldn't have said anything. It's not your concern." "How much, Grace?" The use of her first name should have felt presumptuous, but it did not. $200. By the end of November. He let out a low whistle. "That's a considerable sum." "I know." She felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment mixing with frustration. "I'm working at the Henderson boarding house, taking in mending when I can. But it's not enough. It won't be enough." "What about your father's land? Could you sell it?" "It's mortgaged to the bank. There's barely any equity left after the debts are settled." Daniel removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Grace was coming to recognize as a sign he was thinking hard. "I might have an idea, but I need to talk to my boss first. Can you meet me here tomorrow morning?" "What kind of idea?" "I don't want to say until I know if it's possible. But Grace, don't give up hope yet. God might be answering your prayers in ways you haven't imagined." Before she could press him further, he tipped his hat to her and strode off toward his horse, leaving Grace standing beside her father's grave with more questions than answers, and the first tiny spark of hope she had felt in weeks. The day seemed to drag endlessly. Grace went through her duties at the boarding house in a distracted haze, her mind circling Daniel's words again and again. What kind of idea could a ranch hand have for helping her raise $200? It was not the kind of money ordinary working people kept lying around. Unless he was going to suggest something improper. The thought made her stomach clench with disappointment. She had thought him different, had seen genuine faith and kindness in his eyes. But she had been sheltered, perhaps. Maybe she had misread him entirely. No. Grace shook her head, scrubbing harder at the pot in her hands. She was not usually wrong about people, and every instinct told her that Daniel Irwin was exactly what he seemed to be, a good man trying to help. But what could he possibly do? Sleep came hard that night, and Grace was at the cemetery well before dawn, pacing beside her father's grave as the sky slowly lightened in the east. When she heard hoofbeats approaching, her heart began to race with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Daniel dismounted and walked toward her with purposeful strides, his expression serious but not grim. "Mourning, Grace, mourning." She twisted her hands together, unable to keep still. "You said you had an idea." "I talked to my boss, Fletcher. Explained your situation, that your father was the one who helped him out a few years back with a loan when the cattle market crashed. Fletcher's a fair man, believes in honoring debts of gratitude. He's willing to hire you on at the ranch as a housekeeper. His wife's health has been poor and she could use the help. It pays better than the boarding house, and he'd let you stay in the cottage on the property rent-free. You could save everything you earn." Grace stared at him, hope and caution warring in her chest. "That's generous, but even with better wages, I don't see how I could save $200 in 8 weeks. "You couldn't," Daniel agreed. "But there's more. Fletcher needs someone to manage his accounts, keep his books straight. He knows you can raid and cipher. Says your father mentioned once that you kept his accounts for him. If you could do the same for the ranch, that's worth more than just housekeeping wages." Between the 2 jobs and living rent-free, Fletcher thinks you could save about $75 by the deadline. "That's still not enough." "I know." Daniel took a breath, and she saw something shift in his expression, a vulnerability that matched her own. "That's why I'm offering to lend you the rest. I have money saved, Grace. Not a fortune, but enough. You could pay me back when you're able, no interest, no rush." "I can't accept that." The words came automatically, drilled into her by a lifetime of being taught not to accept charity, not to be beholden. "It's too much." "It's not charity, it's a loan from a friend. We barely know each other." "Then let's remedy that." He gestured to a flat stone near the grave, and they both sat, the pre-dawn chill seeping through their clothes. "I'm 27 years old, from Missouri originally. My father was a school teacher. My mother died when I was young. I came west after father passed, looking for a fresh start and finding it here in Kansas. I work hard, I try to live right, and I believe that we're put on this earth to help each other when we can. Your turn." Grace looked at him, at the earnest set of his features and the kindness in his eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I can. Because your father helped Fletcher and Fletcher's helping you, and I want to help too. Because I know what it's like to face losing everything that connects you to the people you've loved. Because maybe God put me in this cemetery at the same time as you for a reason." He paused. "Or maybe I just think you're the kind of person worth helping, and I hope you'd do the same for someone else if you could." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes, but this time they were not entirely tears of grief. "I would pay you back, every penny. I know you would. It would take time." "I have time." "Why?" She turned to face him fully, needing to understand. "Why would you trust me like this? How do you know I won't just take the money and disappear?" Daniel smiled then, slow and warm. "Call it faith, in God and in you." The words settled over her like a benediction, and Grace realized she was nodding, accepting, agreeing to something that would tie their lives together in ways she could not yet fully understand. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. Okay." His smile widened and he stood, offering her his hand once more. "Come on, let's pray about it and then I'll take you to meet the Fletchers." They knelt together one more time beside Thomas Vernon's grave, and this time when Daniel prayed, he thanked God for answered prayers and unexpected blessings, for the ways divine providence weaved lives together in patterns too intricate for human minds to grasp. Grace added her own amen, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt as though she could breathe fully, as though the crushing weight on her chest had lifted just enough to let hope in. The Fletcher ranch was larger than Grace had expected. A sprawling property with a main house, barn, bunkhouse, and several outbuildings scattered across gently rolling prairie. The cottage Daniel had mentioned was a small structure behind the main house, one room with a sleeping loft, a stove, and a window that looked east toward town. "It's not much," Daniel said as they stood in the doorway, "but it's yours if you want it." "It's perfect," Grace breathed, and she meant it. The cottage was clean and tight against the weather, with a good roof and solid walls. It would be warm in winter, and the privacy of her own space was worth more than she could express. Mrs. Fletcher was a thin woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and a persistent cough that explained why she needed help. "You're Thomas's daughter," she said when Daniel introduced them. "I'm so sorry for your loss, dear. Your father was a good man." "Thank you, madam. Daniel tells us you might be willing to help around the house and with the books. Lord knows I need the former, and my husband could certainly use the latter. He's a fine rancher but a terrible hand with figures. I'd be glad to help with whatever you need." They settled the terms quickly. Grace would work 6 days a week, Sunday off for rest and worship. She would help with cleaning, cooking, laundry, whatever Mrs. Fletcher needed, and spend her afternoons going over the ranch accounts with Mr. Fletcher. In return, she would earn more than double what the boarding house had paid, plus room and board and the cottage rent-free. "When can you start?" Mrs. Fletcher asked. Grace thought of the empty house in town, the silence and grief waiting for her there. "Tomorrow, if that suits you." "It suits us fine." Daniel helped her gather her belongings from the house in town that afternoon, loading her trunk of clothes, her father's Bible, the few pieces of furniture she wanted to keep, into a wagon borrowed from the ranch. Grace walked through each room one final time, saying goodbye to the only home she had ever known. "We can keep the house," Daniel said quietly as she stood in the doorway, reluctant to leave. "You don't have to sell it. Pay off the bank with the loan money and the property is yours free and clear. Someday, when your circumstances change, you can come back if you want. Or I could sell it and pay you back faster. Or you could keep your family home and pay me back slower. I'm not in a rush, Grace." She looked at him, this man who had entered her life less than a week ago and was already changing it in ways she could not have imagined. "I don't understand you, Daniel Irwin." "What's not to understand? Why you're being so kind, what you're getting out of this." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. "Maybe I'm not getting anything out of it except the satisfaction of doing something right. Or maybe I'm hoping that someday you'll look at me and see a friend instead of a stranger who helped you in a hard time. Is that so difficult to believe?" "Yes," she admitted. "Most people want something. I'm not most people." And looking at him, Grace believed it. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. Grace rose early each morning to help Mrs. Fletcher with breakfast for the ranch hands, then spent the morning cleaning and organizing the main house. The work was hard but satisfying, and Mrs. Fletcher was kind, treating Grace more like a companion than a servant. In the afternoons, Grace worked with Mr. Fletcher on the ranch accounts, bringing order to his chaotic system of receipts and scribbled notes. She discovered she had a knack for it, finding patterns and inefficiencies, suggesting ways to reduce costs or better track income from cattle sales. "You've got a good head for this," Mr. Fletcher told her one afternoon, watching as she neatly totaled a column of figures. "Better than mine, that's certain. You're worth every penny we're paying you." But the best part of her days were the mornings. Every dawn, without fail, Grace walked to the edge of the Fletcher property where it bordered the road to town, and Daniel was there, waiting. They would walk together to the cemetery, pray beside her father's grave, and talk about everything and nothing as the sun came up. It was during these morning conversations that Grace began to truly know Daniel. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about the way his father had instilled in him a love of learning and a deep faith that had carried him through hard times. He spoke of his mother, dead before he was old enough to truly remember her, and the ache of that absence that had shaped him in ways he was still discovering. In turn, Grace found herself opening up about her own life, her childhood with her father, the stories he had told her about her mother, the dreams she had harbored of someday attending normal school and becoming a teacher herself, dreams that had died when money grew tight and then disappeared entirely when her father fell ill. "You could still do it," Daniel said one morning as they walked back from the cemetery, the late September air crisp with the promise of autumn. "Become a teacher, I mean, once you've paid off your debts and saved a bit more. I'm 22. I'd be years older than the other students. So, does age make you less capable of learning? No, but it's not practical. I have to think about security now, about keeping a roof over my head. Teaching would give you security." "Maybe." Grace kicked at a pebble, watching it skitter across the dirt road. "It feels like a silly dream now." "Childish." "Dreams aren't childish. They're what keep us moving forward, keep us believing in something better." Daniel slowed his pace, matching his stride to hers. "Don't give up on yours just because the path got harder than you expected." His words stayed with her throughout the day, planting seeds of possibility she had thought long dead. The weeks passed in a blur of work and early morning prayers and slow, steady growing friendship. Grace found herself looking forward to seeing Daniel each dawn with an intensity that surprised her. It was not just gratitude, though she was grateful. It was something more, something that made her heart beat faster when she saw him waiting by the road, something that made her laugh more easily than she had in months, something that kept her awake at night thinking about the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled or the steady warmth of his hand when he helped her over rough ground. She tried to tell herself it was just the circumstances, the heightened emotions of grief and relief tangling together into something that felt like more than it was. But deep down, Grace knew the truth. She was falling in love with Daniel Irwin. The realization terrified her. She had not wanted this, had not been looking for it. She had been focused on survival, on saving her home and honoring her father's memory. Romance had seemed like a luxury she could not afford, a complication she did not need. But love, it seemed, did not wait for convenient timing. October brought cooler weather and the ranch's preparations for winter. The cattle were brought in closer to the property. The barn was stocked with hay. Repairs were made to buildings that needed to weather the coming snow. Grace worked harder than she ever had in her life, but she was saving money at a pace that seemed almost miraculous, watching the careful tallies in her own ledger grow week by week. Daniel had given her the money he had promised, enough to pay off the bank and keep her house. Grace had wept when he handed her the cash, overwhelmed by the reality of his generosity. She had gone to town that same day and settled her father's debts, feeling as though a physical weight had lifted from her shoulders when the banker marked the loan paid in full. Now she owed Daniel, but somehow that felt different. The bank was impersonal, demanding, unforgiving of circumstance or hardship. Daniel was patient, kind, asking nothing of her except that she allow him to help. It was in late October, on a morning when frost painted the prairie grass silver, and their breath came in visible clouds, that everything changed. They had finished their prayers and were walking back toward the ranch when Daniel suddenly stopped in the middle of the road, turning to face Grace with an expression so serious it made her heart stutter. "Grace, I need to tell you something." Fear shot through her. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," At least I hope it's not wrong." He took off his hat, gripping it in both hands. "I've been doing a lot of thinking and a lot of praying, and I can't keep this to myself anymore." "Keep what to yourself?" "This." He gestured between them, his usual eloquence deserting him. "Us. These mornings together. The way I feel when I'm with you, the way I think about you every moment we're apart. Grace, I didn't plan this, didn't expect it, but I've fallen in love with you." The world seemed to tilt sideways, the prairie spinning around her. "What?" "I love you," he repeated, his voice stronger now, more certain. "I know the timing is terrible. I know you're still grieving and rebuilding your life. I know I'm just a ranch hand without much to offer except hard work and a borrowed cottage. But I love you, Grace Vernon, and I had to tell you, even if you don't feel the same way." Grace stared at him, her mind racing. She should be cautious, should think this through, should consider all the practical reasons why this was too fast, too complicated, too much. Instead, she heard herself say, "I love you too." The smile that broke across Daniel's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "You do?" "Yes." The admission made her feel light, as though she might float away on the morning wind. "I tried not to. I told myself it was just gratitude or loneliness or the circumstances throwing us together. But it's none of those things. It's you. The way you pray, the way you listen, the way you see me not as a project to fix but as a person to know. I love you, Daniel." He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, cupping her face in his work-roughened hands. "May I kiss you?" "Yes." His lips met hers, gentle and sure, and Grace felt the last of her carefully maintained walls crumble. She wound her arms around his neck, kissing him back with all the pent-up emotion of the past weeks, all the grief and fear and hope and joy tangling together into something new and precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me." "What?" Grace laughed, the sound bright with happiness and disbelief. "You just told me you loved me 30 seconds ago, and I'll still love you 30 years from now. Why wait?" His thumbs traced gentle circles on her cheeks. "I know it's fast, I know people will talk. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Grace. I want to wake up beside you every morning, pray with you every dawn, build a life with you. Say yes." She should say no. Should insist they wait, court properly, give themselves time to be sure. But looking into his eyes, Grace could not find a single reason to deny what her heart already knew. Yes. The word had barely left her lips before he was kissing her again, laughing against her mouth, spinning her in a circle while she clung to him and laughed too. Joy bubbling up from some deep well inside her that had been empty for too long. "When?" he asked when he set her back on her feet, his hand still on her waist as if afraid to let her go. "Soon." Grace's heart was racing, giddiness making her feel reckless and alive. "There's no reason to wait, is there? I don't have family to plan for, and I don't need a fancy dress or a big celebration. Sunday, then. We'll talk to the preacher today, get the license, and marry this Sunday after service." Daniel's grin was infectious. "Is that too fast? It's perfect." They walked the rest of the way to the ranch hand in hand, making plans in breathless bursts of conversation, grinning at each other like fools. When they arrived, Mrs. Fletcher took one look at them and started laughing. "Well, it's about time," she said from the porch, where she was shelling peas despite the morning chill. "I was wondering how long you two would dance around each other." "You knew." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Dear girl, anyone with eyes could see the way you looked at each other. I've been expecting this announcement for weeks." She set down the bowl of peas and stood. "When's the wedding?" "Sunday," Daniel said, and Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose. "That's quick." "When you know," Daniel replied, squeezing Grace's hand. "No point in waiting when we're both sure." "Well, We'll need to have a proper celebration then, even if it's small. I'll make a cake, and we'll have a dinner here at the ranch after the service. Give me a chance to feed you both properly for once." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Grace continued her work at the ranch, but every spare moment was spent in happy planning with Mrs. Fletcher, who seemed to have adopted the wedding as a personal project. They baked and cleaned and prepared the main house for the small celebration that would follow the ceremony. Daniel rode into town to speak with Reverend Matthews at the Caldwell Community Church, securing his agreement to perform the ceremony on Sunday. He also visited the county clerk to obtain a marriage license and stopped by the general store to purchase a simple gold band for Grace's finger. When he presented it to her on Saturday evening, Grace's eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful. It's simple," he corrected, "but it's yours, just like my heart." They kissed in the fading light behind the cottage, and Grace felt the rightness of it all settle over her like a benediction. In the span of 2 months, she had lost everything and found something better than she had ever imagined. Her father was gone, and she would always grieve him, but he had taught her to trust in God's provision, to believe in the goodness that could come even from tragedy. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the November sky a brilliant blue that seemed to bless the day. Grace dressed in her best gown, a simple dress of deep green that had been her mother's, carefully preserved all these years. Mrs. Fletcher helped her pin up her hair and lent her a lace shawl that had been her own mother's. "Something borrowed," she explained, draping it around Grace's shoulders. "Every bride needs something borrowed. I don't have something old or something blue. Your mother's dress is old, isn't it? And here." Mrs. Fletcher pressed a handkerchief into Grace's palm, the corner embroidered with small blue flowers. "Now you have everything you need." The church was small but full, word having spread through the community about the wedding. Grace saw familiar faces from town, ranch hands from Fletcher's and neighboring properties, Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house beaming from a front pew. They had all come to witness this union, to celebrate with them despite the quick engagement. But Grace only had eyes for Daniel, standing at the front of the church in a new shirt and vest, his hat in his hands and his expression one of such open love and joy that it took her breath away. When their eyes met, he smiled, and Grace felt her own smile answer, wide and unrestrained. The ceremony was simple and brief. Reverend Matthews spoke of love and commitment, of God's design for marriage as a reflection of his love for his church, of the seriousness and joy of the vows they were about to take. Then he asked them to turn and face each other, to speak their promises before God and witnesses. Daniel went first, his voice steady and sure. "Grace, I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you all the days of my life. I promise to pray with you every morning, to work beside you, to support your dreams and share your burdens. I promise to be faithful in good times and hard times, in sickness and health, for as long as we both shall live." Grace's voice trembled but held as she made her own vows. "Daniel, I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you all the days of my life. I promise to be your partner and your friend, to build a life with you founded on faith and trust. I promise to stand beside you through whatever may come, to believe in you as you have believed in me, for as long as we both shall live." Daniel slipped the gold band onto her finger, and Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride." The kiss was chaste, appropriate for the setting, but Grace felt the promise in it, the commitment and love that would carry them through whatever lay ahead. When they turned to face the congregation, the applause and cheers seemed to fill every corner of the small church. They walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Irwin, and stepped out into the November sunshine as man and wife. The celebration at the Fletcher Ranch was everything Grace could have wanted, warm and full of laughter and love. Mrs. Fletcher had outdone herself with the food, presenting a feast that seemed impossible given the short notice. There was roasted chicken and ham, fresh bread and butter, vegetables from the ranch's root cellar, and a beautiful cake with white frosting that Mrs. Fletcher admitted she had stayed up all night decorating. "To the bride and groom," Mr. Fletcher said, raising his glass of cider, "may your love grow deeper with every passing year, and may you be blessed with health, happiness, and a house full of children." "Hear, hear," the guests echoed, and Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the warmth of it all. She had expected to feel nervous on her wedding day, uncertain and overwhelmed. Instead, she felt only peace and a deep, settled joy. This was right. Daniel was right. They were right together. As the afternoon stretched into evening and the guests began to depart, Grace found herself standing at the edge of the porch with Daniel, watching the sun set over the prairie in shades of orange and gold. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Irwin?" Daniel asked, his arm around her waist. "Happy," Grace replied simply. "Happier than I ever thought I could be, especially after everything that's happened. Your father would be glad, I think, to know you're loved and cared for. He would have liked you." Grace leaned into her husband's solid warmth, the word husband still feeling new and wonderful in her mind. "He would have appreciated the way you pray, the way you helped without asking for anything in return." "I got everything in return," Daniel corrected. "I got you." They stood in comfortable silence as the last of the daylight faded, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, as the first stars began to appear, Daniel took Grace's hand. "Ready to go home, wife, home." The word settled over Grace like a warm blanket. Home was not the house in town where she had grown up, empty now of everyone she loved. Home was not even the cottage where she had been staying. Home was wherever Daniel was, wherever they were together. "Ready, husband." They walked to the cottage hand in hand, and when Daniel lifted her over the threshold, Grace laughed, the sound bright and free in the darkness. He set her down gently in the middle of the single room, lit only by the lamp he had left burning earlier, and cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Grace Irwin. I love you too." They came together slowly, reverently, two people learning to be one, and Grace marveled at the tenderness in her husband's touch, the patience and care he showed. They spoke in whispers and soft laughter, learning each other in the lamplight, making promises with their bodies that echoed the vows they had spoken that morning. Later, lying in Daniel's arms in the narrow bed, Grace felt more content than she had thought possible just months ago. Everything had changed so quickly. Grief and love tangled together in ways she was still processing. But this, the warmth of her husband's embrace, the steady rhythm of his breathing as he slept, the gold band on her finger catching the faint moonlight from the window, this was real and good and right. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, not entirely sure if she was speaking to Daniel or to God or to both. "Thank you for this gift." The winter that followed was hard in the way all Kansas winters were hard, with snow that piled in drifts and wind that cut through even the thickest coat. But Grace had never been warmer. She continued her work for the Fletchers, now with Daniel working the same ranch, and they saved every penny they could, not just to repay Daniel's loan but to build a future together. They moved into the house in town, Grace's childhood home, in early spring, spending evenings fixing it up, repairing years of deferred maintenance and making it truly theirs. Daniel built new shelves for Grace's books and a bigger table for the kitchen. Grace planted a garden twice the size of what her father had kept, dreaming of the vegetables they would harvest come summer. They still prayed together every morning, though now it was kneeling beside their own bed instead of at the cemetery. They visited Thomas Vernon's grave every Sunday after church, Grace bringing fresh flowers when the season allowed and telling her father about her life, about how happy she was, about the grandchildren she hoped someday to give him in memory. By the time their first anniversary arrived, Grace had paid back half of Daniel's loan, insisting on it despite his protests. They celebrated quietly, just the two of them, with a special dinner Grace cooked, and a new shirt she had sewn for Daniel from cloth she had carefully saved to purchase. "I have something to tell you," Grace said as they finished their meal, her heart racing with nervous excitement. Daniel looked up from his plate, immediately attentive. "What is it?" "I'm expecting a baby due next spring." The joy that flooded his face made Grace's eyes fill with tears. He was around the table in an instant, pulling her into his arms, laughing and thanking God and kissing her forehead over and over. "A baby," he kept repeating. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" "Happy, Grace, I'm over the moon. I'm thanking God for this blessing. I'm terrified out of my mind and so excited I could burst." He pulled back just enough to look at her. "How are you feeling? Are you well? Do you need to see the doctor?" "I'm fine," Grace assured him, touched by his concern. "Mrs. Fletcher has been helping me, telling me what to expect. She's delivered half the babies in Caldwell, it seems. Still, we should have the doctor check on you just to be sure." They did, and the doctor confirmed what Grace already knew. She was healthy, the baby was growing well, and if all continued as it should, they would welcome a child into the world in April. The pregnancy was easy, or as easy as such things ever were. Grace continued working for the Fletchers in reduced capacity, Mrs. Fletcher treating her like a daughter, insisting she rest more and fussing over her diet. Daniel was attentive to the point of being comical, constantly asking if she needed anything, helping with every task no matter how small. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Grace told him one evening when he insisted on carrying the water bucket for her. "I know. I just want to take care of you. You do take care of me. You've been taking care of me since the morning you sat down beside me in that cemetery and asked if you could pray with me." Daniel set down the bucket and pulled her close, one hand resting gently on her growing belly. "That was the best decision I ever made. Sitting down beside a crying woman in a graveyard, sitting down beside you." Their son was born on a rainy April morning, arriving with a healthy set of lungs that announced his presence to the world. Daniel was there throughout, holding Grace's hand, wiping her forehead, whispering encouragement and prayers. When the baby finally came, pink and squalling and perfect, Daniel wept openly, overcome with emotion. "A boy, Mrs. Fletcher announced, placing the cleaned and swaddled infant in Grace's arms. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Grace looked down at her son's tiny face, at his dark hair and the way his fingers curled around hers, and felt love crash over her like a wave. This was her child, hers and Daniel's, a living symbol of the love they shared and the life they had built together. "What should we name him?" Daniel asked, sitting on the edge of the bed, one arm around Grace and one finger caught in the baby's tiny grip. Grace thought of her father, of the man who had raised her with love and faith, who had taught her to trust in God's provision even when circumstances seemed impossible. She thought of how he would have loved to meet his grandson, to hold this child and tell him stories and pass on his wisdom. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Daniel Irwin. Thomas." Daniel tested the name, smiling. "It's perfect. Hello, Tommy. Welcome to the world, son." The years that followed were full in the way that young families are full, with work and growth and the constant adventure of raising children. Grace had worried that motherhood might end her dreams of teaching, But Daniel surprised her on Tommy's second birthday with news that he had been speaking with the town council. "Caldwell needs a school," he explained, his eyes bright with excitement. "The children around here are growing up with no education, and the council wants to change that. They need a teacher, Grace. Someone who can read and write, who understands figures, who has patience and heart. They need you. But Tommy is only 2 and I'm expecting again." Grace placed a hand on her gently rounded belly, where their second child grew. "The school wouldn't start until fall after this baby is born. Mrs. Fletcher has already said she'd watch the children while you teach. Grace, this is your dream. Don't let it pass you by." So Grace studied, reading every book she could borrow, preparing lessons and learning pedagogy from manuals Daniel ordered from back east. When their daughter, Sarah, was born in late summer, Grace took only a few weeks to recover before beginning her preparations in earnest. The Caldwell School opened in September of that year in a small building on the edge of town, with Grace as its first and only teacher. She taught children of all ages, from 6-year-olds learning their letters to teenagers studying advanced mathematics and literature. It was exhausting work, balancing teaching with motherhood and her continued bookkeeping for the Fletchers, but Grace had never been happier. Daniel supported her in every way, taking on more of the household duties, caring for the children when she needed to prepare lessons, never complaining about the long hours she worked or the passion she poured into her students. He was a full partner in every sense, sharing the burdens and the joys equally. They had 4 children in total, spaced over the course of 10 years. Thomas, Sarah, Matthew, and finally little Grace, named for her mother. Each birth was a blessing, each child a unique personality that enriched their lives in ways they could not have imagined. The house in town grew and changed with them. Daniel added rooms as the family expanded, built a bigger porch where they could sit on summer evenings and watch the children play. Grace's garden became a neighborhood landmark, overflowing with vegetables and flowers that she shared generously with anyone who needed them. They became pillars of the Caldwell community, known for their faith, their generosity, and the love that was evident to anyone who saw them together. Grace taught hundreds of children over the years, many of whom went on to become teachers themselves, spreading literacy and learning across Kansas. Daniel worked his way up from ranch hand to foreman to part owner of the Fletcher Ranch, Mr. Fletcher having no children of his own and insisting that Daniel's hard work and dedication deserved reward. When Mr. Fletcher passed away in his sleep at the age of 73, he left the ranch jointly to Daniel and Mrs. Fletcher, with the understanding that Daniel would run it and care for Mrs. Fletcher for as long as she lived. Through it all, through prosperity and hardship, through the joy of births and the sorrow of deaths, through the changing seasons and the passing years, Grace and Daniel kept their morning tradition. Every dawn they prayed together, thanking God for His blessings, asking for His guidance, remembering the cemetery morning when they had first met and the question that had changed both their lives. "May I pray with you?" Those 5 words had opened a door to a future Grace had never imagined, a life richer and fuller than any she had dreamed. She had learned that sometimes God's answers came not in miraculous interventions, but in the form of a kind man kneeling in the dust, offering comfort and company in grief. She had learned that love could grow in the most unexpected places, that faith could move mountains if you were willing to let God work through willing hands. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Grace and Daniel returned to the cemetery where they had met, this time with their children and grandchildren in tow. Thomas was married now with 2 children of his own. Sarah was engaged to a young lawyer from Topeka. Matthew was working the Fletcher Ranch alongside his father, And little Grace, not so little at 15, was preparing to attend normal school in the fall to follow in her mother's footsteps as a teacher. They stood together beside Thomas Vernon's grave, which Daniel had maintained carefully over the years, keeping it free of weeds and marking it with fresh flowers. "Tell them the story, Mama," little Grace urged. "Tell them how you and Papa met." So Grace did, recounting that morning 25 years ago when she had knelt in the dust, broken and afraid, praying for a miracle. She told them about the stranger who had sat beside her, asking if he could pray with her. She told them about the kindness that had followed, the loan, the job, the friendship that had bloomed into love. "Your grandfather never got to meet you," she said, looking at her grandchildren, "but he would have loved you all so much. And I think he'd be glad to know that his death, as hard as it was, led me to your grandfather Daniel, led to all of you." "God works in mysterious ways," Daniel added, his arm around Grace's waist. "We don't always understand his plan in the moment, but looking back, we can see how he was weaving everything together for good." "You still pray together every morning?" Thomas asked, his own arm around his wife. "Every single morning," Grace confirmed. "Your father taught me that prayer is not just asking for things, but sharing your heart with God and with each other. It's been the foundation of our marriage." They prayed together then, all of them, 3 generations united in faith and gratitude. When they finished and began walking back to the wagons, Daniel held Grace back for a moment, wanting a private word. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, searching her face. "Not a single one." Grace reached up to cup his cheek, marveling at the silver in his hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years of laughter and hard work. "You've given me a beautiful life, Daniel Irwin." "We've given each other a beautiful life," he corrected. "Partners, remember? In everything." "In everything," she agreed. They kissed there in the cemetery, no longer young but still deeply in love, and Grace thought about the terrified young woman she had been, kneeling in the dust and begging God for help. She thought about the man who had appeared like an answer to prayer, offering not pity but partnership, not rescue but respect. She thought about the life they had built together, brick by brick, prayer by prayer, choice by choice. About the children they had raised and the community they had served. About the early mornings and late nights, the laughter and tears, the ordinary moments that had woven together into something extraordinary. "Thank you," she whispered against Daniel's lips, "for sitting beside me that morning. For asking if you could pray with me. Thank you for saying yes." They stood together in the late afternoon sunshine, the prairie wind carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of harvest. Their children and grandchildren were waiting by the wagons, ready to head home for the anniversary celebration Grace knew Sarah had been planning for weeks. Home. After all these years, the word still filled Grace with warmth. Home was the house Daniel had built and expanded, filled with memories and laughter. Home was the ranch where they worked side by side. Home was the school where Grace taught and the church where they worshiped. Home was the cemetery where they had met and continued to visit, honoring the past while living fully in the present. But most of all, home was wherever Daniel was, just as it had been since that November morning when she became Grace Irwin. They walked back to the wagons hand in hand, ready for whatever the next chapter would bring, secure in the knowledge that they would face it together, as they had faced everything for 25 years. In prayer, in partnership, in love that had started with a simple question and grown into a lifetime of answered prayers. The celebration that evening was joyous, with food and music and speeches that made them both laugh and cry. Mrs. Fletcher, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, stood to offer a toast. "I remember the day these two came to me, barely knowing each other but already starting to fall in love whether they realized it or not. I've watched their love grow over these 25 years, watched them face hardships and blessings with equal grace, watched them build not just a family but a legacy. Here's to Grace and Daniel Irwin, proof that God's timing is perfect even when we can't see it yet. Hear, hear, everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Later, after the guests had gone home and the children had taken the little ones to bed, Grace and Daniel sat on their porch swing, wrapped in a shared blanket against the November chill. The stars were brilliant overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the night. 25 years, Daniel mused. Where did the time go? Into every moment, Grace replied. Into every morning prayer and evening meal, every child raised and lesson taught, every sunrise we've watched together. The time didn't go anywhere. We lived it fully. What do you think the next 25 years will bring? Grace laughed softly. God only knows, but I'm not worried. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Together, Daniel agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. Always together. They sat in comfortable silence, the swing rocking gently until the cold drove them inside to the warm house and the comfortable bed they had shared for a quarter century. They knelt beside it, as they did every night, and said their evening prayers before climbing under the quilts Grace's students had made as an anniversary gift. I love you, Grace Irwin, Daniel whispered in the darkness. I love you too, Daniel Irwin, she whispered back. And as she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, Grace thought once more of that cemetery morning so long ago, of the question that had changed everything. She thought of the man who had seen her praying alone and chosen to sit beside her, offering comfort and companionship when she needed it most. She thought of all the mornings since, thousands of them now, each one beginning with prayer and ending with gratitude. She thought of the children who would continue their legacy, teaching their own children to pray, to have faith, to believe in the goodness of God and the power of love. She thought of how far she had come from that scared, grieving young woman, how much she had grown and learned and become. And she knew that, while she had worked hard for the life she now lived, had made good choices and persevered through difficulties, the foundation of it all had been laid in that moment when a stranger had offered to pray with her. Grace Vernon had gone to the cemetery that morning alone and desperate. She had come home Grace Irwin, loved and hopeful, and in the end, that was the greatest blessing of all. The years continued their steady march, bringing new challenges and new joys in equal measure. Thomas took over more of the ranch operations as Daniel began to slow down, not from any illness but simply the natural progression of age. Sarah and her husband moved back to Caldwell after several years in Topeka, Sarah opening a law practice that served the growing community with distinction. Matthew married a girl from a neighboring ranch and brought her home to the Fletcher place, building a small house not far from his parents. And young Grace graduated from normal school at the top of her class, coming home to teach alongside her mother at the Caldwell School, which had grown to 2 buildings and 3 teachers by then. The grandchildren multiplied, each one a blessing, each one carrying forward the legacy of faith and hard work that Grace and Daniel had established. The house that had once seemed too big when it was just the 2 of them was now always full of visiting family, of laughter and arguments, and the beautiful chaos of a large, loving family. Mrs. Fletcher passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87, leaving the ranch entirely to Daniel in her will, along with a letter thanking him for the years of faithful service and friendship. Grace wept at the funeral, remembering the woman who had given her a chance when she desperately needed one, who had become like a mother to her in the years after Thomas Vernon's death. They buried Mrs. Fletcher in the Caldwell Cemetery, not far from Grace's father, and added her to the list of people they remembered in their morning prayers, thanking God for the impact she had made on their lives. When Grace turned 50, Daniel threw her a surprise party that brought people from all over Kansas, former students and fellow teachers, ranch families and town friends, everyone whose life had been touched by Grace Vernon Irwin over the course of 5 decades. They shared stories and laughter, and Grace was overwhelmed by the realization of how many lives she had affected, how many people considered her not just a teacher but a friend, a mentor, a blessing. "Did you ever imagine this?" Daniel asked her that night as they cleaned up after the party, working side by side as they had for 30 years of marriage. "Imagine what?" "All of this. The teaching, the family, the impact you've had on this community." Grace paused, a stack of plates in her hands, thinking about the question seriously. "No," she finally said. "When I was 22 and kneeling at my father's grave, I couldn't have imagined any of this. I was just trying to survive, trying to find a way to keep going. I never dreamed I could have a life this full, this blessed." "You deserve it all," Daniel said firmly. "You've worked hard, loved well, and given so much to others." "We've done it together," Grace corrected, setting down the plates to face her husband. "Everything good in my life has been because you sat down beside me that morning and offered to pray with me. You saved me, Daniel." "No," he shook his head, pulling her close. "We saved each other. I was just drifting before I met you, working hard but without real purpose. You gave me a reason to build a life instead of just live one. We saved each other." They held each other in the quiet kitchen, two people who had grown old together but whose love had only deepened with the years, and Grace knew he was right. They had saved each other, had chosen each other every day for 3 decades, had built something beautiful out of grief and faith and determination. When Daniel turned 60, his children surprised him by commissioning a sign for the ranch, officially renaming it the Irwin Fletcher Ranch in honor of both families. Daniel cried when they unveiled it, touched beyond words by the gesture. "Your legacy," Grace told him that night. "You've built something that will last long after we're gone." "We've built it," he corrected, as he always did, "together." They were blessed to remain healthy well into their 60s and 70s. Still working the ranch, though, at a slower pace. Still teaching, though Grace had officially retired and now only tutored children who needed extra help. Their morning prayers continued without fail, each day beginning with gratitude and ending with peace. They were married 47 years when Daniel had a stroke. It came suddenly, without warning, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in May. One moment he was standing in the barn talking to Thomas about the new calves, and the next he was on the ground, his speech slurred, one side of his body refusing to cooperate. Grace, called from the house by Thomas's shouts, ran faster than she had in years, her heart in her throat. When she saw Daniel on the ground, fear unlike anything she had felt since her father's death gripped her chest. "No," she breathed, falling to her knees beside him. "No, no, no, Daniel, stay with me. Please stay with me." "Grace," he managed to say, his voice thick and difficult. "Love you." "I love you too. Don't you dare leave me, Daniel Irwin. We still have more mornings to pray together, more years to live. Don't you dare leave me." The doctor came quickly, examining Daniel with grave efficiency before ordering him carried to the house and put to bed. The diagnosis was what they had feared, a stroke that had affected his right side and his speech. The prognosis was uncertain. Some people recovered fully from such things, the doctor explained. Others did not recover at all. For weeks, the outcome hung in the balance. Grace barely left Daniel's side, sleeping in a chair beside their bed, helping him with every task, encouraging him through the frustrating work of relearning how to speak clearly. how to use his right hand, how to walk without stumbling. "Going to be okay," Daniel told her one afternoon, his speech still halting but clearer than it had been. "God's not done with me yet." "You better be right," Grace said fiercely, holding his good hand in both of hers. "We have a deal, Daniel Irwin. We pray together every morning and we're not stopping now." So they prayed, Grace doing most of the speaking when Daniel's words failed him, but always together, always unified in faith that had sustained them through nearly 5 decades of marriage. Slowly, miraculously, Daniel improved. The speech came back first, then gradually the use of his right side. He would never be quite as strong as he had been before the stroke, would always walk with a slight limp and tire more easily. But he was alive and himself, and still Grace's partner in every way that mattered. "Thought I was going to lose you," Grace admitted one morning as they knelt beside their bed for prayer, both of them moving more stiffly than they once had but still keeping their sacred routine. "Not yet," Daniel replied, his voice still a little slow but clear. "God answered your prayers again, Grace, just like he did when we first met. He brought you to me then," Grace said, "and he kept you with me now. I'm grateful for both." They were in their early 70s when the town held a celebration in their honor, recognizing 50 years of service to Caldwell and the surrounding community. The turnout was incredible, with former students now middle-aged, with grandchildren of people Grace and Daniel had helped, with 3 generations of families who had worked the ranch or attended the school, or simply been touched by the Irwins' consistent example of faith and love. The mayor gave a speech about legacy and commitment. Thomas spoke about his parents' example of partnership and faith. Young Grace, now a veteran teacher herself with children of her own, talked about watching her mother balance work and family without ever making anyone feel like they came second. Sarah described her father's steady support of her unconventional choice to become a lawyer, his belief that women could do anything they set their minds to. But the moment that touched Grace most deeply came when a middle-aged man she did not immediately recognize stood up to speak. He introduced himself as Peter Morgan, a student in her very first class at the Caldwell School. "Mrs. Irwin probably doesn't remember me," he began. "I was one of 15 students that first year, a 11-year-old boy who could barely read and was convinced I was too stupid to learn. But Mrs. Irwin didn't believe that. She stayed after school with me every day for months, patiently working through letters and sounds and words until they finally started to make sense. She taught me to read, but more than that, she taught me that I was capable of learning, that I had value and potential." I went on to become a teacher myself because of her example, and I've taught hundreds of children over the past 40 years. Every single one of them benefited from what Mrs. Irwin taught me, not just about reading but about believing in people. That's a legacy that will last forever. Grace was crying openly by the time he finished, and when Daniel squeezed her hand, she saw that his eyes were damp too. They had never sought recognition or reward for their work, had simply tried to live faithfully and serve well. But hearing the impact of those choices, understanding the ripple effect of their lives, was overwhelming in the best possible way. That night, back in their own home surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren now, Grace and Daniel sat once more on their porch swing, watching the stars come out over the Kansas prairie. "Quite a day," Daniel murmured, his arm around Grace's shoulders. "Quite a life," Grace corrected. "I still can't believe sometimes that this is my life, that I'm married to you, that we have this beautiful family and community. All because I asked if I could pray with you. All because I said yes." Grace turned to look at her husband, this man she had loved for half a century, whose face was as dear to her now as it had been when they first married. If I could go back to that morning in the cemetery, knowing everything that would follow, I would make the same choices all over again. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, they made the good parts sweeter, made us stronger. She paused. I'd live it all again exactly the same just to end up here with you. I'd ask if I could kiss you, Daniel said with a smile, but I think after 50 years of marriage I can skip the asking. After 50 years of marriage, you better kiss me without asking, Grace retorted, and laughed when he did exactly that. They grew old together, as old people do, their bodies slowing but their love never wavering. They saw grandchildren marry and great-grandchildren born. They watched Caldwell grow from a small frontier town into a thriving community with schools and churches and businesses, knowing they had played a part in that growth. When Grace was 78 and Daniel 82, they made one last trip to the cemetery where they had met 56 years earlier. It took them longer to walk there now, and they brought a bench to sit on because kneeling had become too difficult. But they still went, still prayed, still remembered. You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that morning? Grace asked, sitting beside her husband in the quiet of early dawn. If you had just ridden past, all the time, Daniel admitted. But then, I remember that I believe God had a plan, that He put me in that place at that time for a reason. So maybe there is no alternative. Maybe that morning was always going to happen exactly as it did. I like that thought. Me too. They sat together as the sun came up, painting the prairie in shades of gold and pink, and Grace felt a deep contentment settle over her. She had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and purpose and faith. When her time came to join her father and all the others who had gone before, she would go with gratitude for every single day she had been given. But she hoped, prayed, that day was still far off. There were still great-grandchildren to cuddle, still students to encourage, still mornings to share with the man who had changed her life with a simple question. May I pray with you? The question that had led to a lifetime of answered prayers, of partnership and love, of building something beautiful out of grief and faith. The question that had saved them both. Daniel Irwin passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 86, with Grace beside him as she had been for nearly 60 years of marriage. The funeral was the largest Caldwell had ever seen, with people coming from all over Kansas and beyond to pay their respects to a man who had touched countless lives through his faith, his generosity, and his unwavering commitment to doing right. Grace stood at the gravesite, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and felt the weight of loss pressing down on her chest. But even in grief, she felt gratitude for the years they had shared, for the life they had built, for the legacy they were leaving behind. He was a good man, Thomas said quietly, his arm around his mother. The best man I ever knew. Yes, Grace agreed. He was. She continued living in their home, refusing all offers to move in with children, insisting she was perfectly capable of caring for herself, and she was for a time. She kept teaching the occasional student who needed extra help, kept tending her garden, kept attending church every Sunday. But most of all, she kept praying. Every morning at dawn, Grace would kneel beside her bed, in the same spot where she and Daniel had prayed together for so many years, and she would talk to God. She thanked Him for Daniel, for their children, for the life they had shared. She prayed for her family, for the community, for all those who were struggling as she had once struggled. And sometimes, in the quiet of early morning, she felt Daniel's presence beside her, as real as if he was still alive and kneeling at her side. She knew it was probably just memory, just wishful thinking, but it comforted her nonetheless. Grace Vernon Irwin passed away 18 months after her husband, at the age of 80, found peacefully in her sleep by young Grace, who had come to check on her. The doctor said her heart simply stopped, worn out after 8 decades of life and love. They buried her beside Daniel in the Caldwell Cemetery, not far from her father's grave. The funeral was as well attended as Daniel's had been, a testament to the impact she had made over the course of her 80 years. At the service, young Grace stood to speak about her grandmother, about the woman who had taught her not just how to read but how to live, how to love, how to face hardship with faith and joy with gratitude. "My grandmother told me once," she said, her voice strong despite the tears on her cheeks, "that God answers prayers in unexpected ways. She went to that cemetery 58 years ago broken and alone, and God sent her my grandfather, a man who asked if he could pray with her. That simple question changed both their lives, led to a marriage that blessed everyone who witnessed it, led to a family that now spans 4 generations, led to a legacy of faith and service that will continue long after we're all gone." She paused, looking out at the crowd of mourners. "My grandmother taught hundreds of children to read, including my grandfather, who became a teacher because of her. She kept books for a ranch that prospered under her organized management. She raised 4 children who all became productive members of society. She loved one man faithfully for 60 years and continued to honor him every day of the 18 months she lived after his death. But most importantly, she taught all of us what it means to trust God, to pray without ceasing, and to meet every person with compassion and respect. That is her legacy. That is what we carry forward." After the funeral, the family gathered at the house that Daniel had built and expanded over the course of his life. They shared stories and tears and laughter, remembering the woman who had been the center of their family, the heart that had held them all together. "She would want us to celebrate," Sarah said firmly when the mood grew too somber. "She would want us to remember how blessed we were to have her, not just mourn that she's gone." So they did. They celebrated Grace Vernon Irwin, teacher and wife and mother and grandmother and great-grandmother. They celebrated a life well lived, a faith well kept, a love that had transformed everyone it touched. And the next morning, as dawn broke over Caldwell, Kansas, Thomas and his wife walked to the cemetery together. They stood before the graves of Thomas's grandparents and his grandmother Grace and his father Daniel, and they prayed. "May I pray with you?" Thomas's wife asked, echoing words that had been spoken so many decades ago. "Always," Thomas replied. And they did, continuing a tradition that had started with a simple question in a cemetery, a tradition that had sustained a family through joy and sorrow, a tradition that would be passed down to their children and grandchildren, and on through the generations. Because some legacies are not measured in wealth or property or achievements, but in the simple, profound impact of 2 people who chose to pray together, to love faithfully, to build a life on the foundation of faith and trust and partnership. Grace and Daniel had built such a legacy, and it would endure long after their bodies had returned to the Kansas soil they had loved so well, long after the last person who remembered them personally had passed on, carried forward in the lives they had touched and the example they had set. In the end, that was more than enough. It was everything. And somewhere, in whatever realm exists beyond this one, Grace and Daniel knelt side by side once more, praying together as they had done for 60 years, thanking God for the gift of each other and the beautiful life they had shared, complete and content and together for eternity.